Reality-Based Thinking, Rethinking the World with Jack Pelham, Episode 1, Introduction, Part 1 of 3. Welcome to this first episode of Reality-Based Thinking, Rethinking the World with Jack Pelham. That's me, your host. This is a show in which we think about thinking, both in a theoretical sense and most definitely in a practical or applied sense. We're going to tackle the controversial topics of the day, both in politics and religion, but we're going to do it from a fresh perspective in several ways. First of all, we're going to look at what kind of thinking people do in order to reach those controversial conclusions. And this is quite different from the way that so many people think about differing opinions. Many think of them just like they think of matters of personal taste or preference, such as how you and I may differ as to whether apples or oranges are better. I will demonstrate that many, not all, but many of the differences that divide us as people are not mere matters of opinion at all, but of differences in how we handle reality. We live in a real world with real-world consequences, but not everybody handles reality in the same way. There are big differences between one person and the next regarding how much of reality we embrace, how much of it we understand, how willing we are to flow with it, how much we try to change about the parts of reality we don't like, and how much we manage to change about it, and particularly about how much we try to fool ourselves with regard to what reality is really like. Now, if you're like a lot of people, as I was just talking about the differences from one person to the next, you might have been really relating to that, and maybe even thinking something like, yeah, I sure know some folks who don't do very well with reality. But the fact of the matter is that we ourselves make far more errors in our judgment than most of us think we do. That is, our thoughts, decisions, and beliefs, and actions don't always match up with reality as closely as we think. And here's one thing that makes the goal of this show quite different from most, because we're going to tackle that. I'm not looking to embarrass anybody or to attack anybody or to use inflammatory language to get people riled up and divided. Rather, I'm here to help us understand that there are some universal qualities that make up the difference between good thinking and bad thinking, and that we're all vulnerable to doing that bad thinking, regardless of whatever our philosophies and group affiliations may be. Now, here's another thing in which I hope this series to be different from many others. It is my sincere goal to get nothing wrong in what I say here, ever. I don't want to say anything I haven't already vetted, and I don't want to exaggerate anything or fudge on anything, nor to skim over or to ignore important matters either. Now, I'm not an infallible person, just like you're not infallible. So this means that if I want to get everything right, I'm going to have to work very hard and diligently on it. But I think that's worth the effort. And that probably makes me fairly unusual, statistically speaking, because these values are just not all that common in our culture. And it's that unusual angle that might just make this show worth your time, if you're into that sort of thing. I don't work under that old compromised goal where you try to do more good than harm. My goal is to do no harm at all. And here's an unusual statement. I do not believe that I have a moral right to hold to a wrong opinion. Yes, I may have a legal right to hold to it, but not a moral one. No, I choose to go beyond the societal norm in trying to see to it that my thoughts, decisions, and beliefs map accurately onto the real world. And I'll leave it to my audience to decide how well I execute that goal. Now, another thing that may well make this show different is this, and this is a big one. I see no need to protect people from the truth. I'm not afraid of what people might think or do or how they might feel if they were to discover the truth of a matter. In fact, I'm quite the opposite. I say, yeah, let's find out. I have no motive to deceive or to hide anything. I have no political or religious affiliations to protect, nor any means of profiting from what happens or does not happen in politics or religion. So I'm not here to protect anybody from the truth or from reality. If you were to analyze a lot of other shows, you'd see that a lot of the time there's a problem not so much with what they talk about, but with what they avoid talking about. That is, they're not interested in talking about the whole truth of a matter, but only that portion of the truth that tends to look good for their particular side of an argument. But here, I don't mind laying it all out on the table, because the truth is the truth, no matter who believes it or who likes it. Again, one of the main ways in which this show will be unique is that rather than just focusing on the conclusions that people draw, we'll focus just as much on the methods and processes by which those conclusions are drawn. This show is about the quality of our thinking, and ultimately it's about what kind of people we are. That is, this show asks the question, what kind of person would come up with a conclusion like that? Is that conclusion honest? Is it rational? Is it responsible? Is it based in reality? As we will discover at length, a great many of the conclusions that are popularly passed around and believed in our society are the work of people who were failing in one or more of these three things: honesty, rationality, and responsibility. And now we have this culture that's psychologically conditioned by the constant repetition of a great many flawed conclusions that need to be reworked. Hence the title of this series, Reality-Based Thinking, Rethinking the World with Jack Pelham. In this show, I'll be introducing my own philosophy that I call Reality-Based Thinking, or RBT for short. It focuses on three main things that I've already mentioned: honesty, rationality, and responsibility. I'll discuss writings about human thinking, whether they be from cognitive science or from the Bible or from other literature, and we'll get into controversial topics of the day, but not from the standard left versus right point of view, or a this denomination versus that denomination point of view. No, the very deliberate and disciplined goal here is to see the world as it actually is, rather than to get caught up in some biased, party-driven, or faction-driven perception of it. And on this point, let me reiterate that I'm not a member of any political party nor of any church institution, so I want you to be careful not to assume that the things I say on this show must simply be because I'm a this or a that. I will surely agree with some of the things that a this or that would say, just as I will surely disagree with other things they would say. My goal in thinking is not to think like a this or that would think, but to think in a way that jibes with reality, in a way that maps accurately onto the real world. As we shall see, political parties and other human institutions tend to get some things right and some things wrong, and a lot of it very wrong. And their members tend somewhat to lump all the issues together into a package, as if being a member means that one has to take as givens all the bullet points on the What We Believe page. But here, we're going to have the courage to look at issues one at a time, and to consider what the reality of a matter really is, without deferring to what some institution may tell us we're supposed to think about it. So we're going to look at common thinking errors, things that are very widespread in our culture, to an epidemic level, actually. And we're going to examine how those errors lead us to erroneous conclusions about the world in which we live. And then we'll look at how to get those things right. Indeed, getting things right is the goal here. The goal is to be a realitan. Now, that's a word I coined to name somebody who deliberately lives in reality and who develops the thinking skills necessary to thrive in it. Later in this episode, we'll get into the Jack, Ann, and George problem from cognitive science. And that exercise will help to serve as something of an introduction to how this series is going to run in general. That is, we'll look at some common thinking errors that have been documented in cognitive science and in the Bible and in other literature, and then we'll explore some of the real-world consequences of those errors in our daily lives. We'll look at controversial things like politics and religion, and we'll identify the errors in popular thinking, and see if we can't make better sense of the world than people generally tend to make of it. So let's jump right in with a question that will highlight one of the main themes of this video podcast series. Question: suppose you were to see a horse out grazing in a pasture and notice that the horse has 4 legs, as horses generally do, but that this horse is using only 3. Suppose that the 4th leg is just dangling about, and that the horse is awkwardly getting around without using that 4th leg. Now let me ask you, what would you naturally think about that horse? Would you think there's something wrong with that horse? Well, if you're like most people, you would. And why? Because if you're like most people, you've seen lots and lots of horses over your lifetime, whether in person or on TV or in the movies, and you have a sense of what normal horse behavior and function is like. And this horse doesn't match with what you know to be normal. But let me tell you something more about this particular horse with the dangling leg. With this particular horse, there's nothing at all wrong with that dangling leg. It's neither injured nor deformed. Rather, this particular horse simply took a notion one day not to use that leg anymore. So he quit. Sure, it causes all kinds of problems. It puts extra strain on the rest of his body. It makes it harder to eat. He's not really able to run. It's extremely hard to lie down and to get up and to defend himself from predators and so forth. But that's what the horse wants. So that's what it does. It has simply given up the use of one of its natural faculties because it took a notion to do so, and for no other reason. Now tell me what you think about that horse. If you're like most people, I'll bet you went from a position of sympathy for the horse to one of bewilderment as to why any horse would willingly cripple itself like this in its own mind by its own needless choice. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that most people are quite like that horse in a way. With us, it's not our limbs that we decide not to fully utilize, it's certain natural functions of our minds. The human mind is capable of some pretty impressive tasks, things that can be really good for us. But just because it's capable, that doesn't mean that it automatically springs into action to do these things. No, some of what the mind can do must be done deliberately, voluntarily. And I'm going to tell you that most of us make quite the reluctant volunteer. We tend to avoid that sort of deliberate activity to an appreciable degree, and we do it as a way of life. We just don't want to go to the effort. Cognitive scientists have named this tendency not to exert ourselves mentally. They call us cognitive misers. Cognitive miser. The term was coined to describe the tendency of the human mind to avoid expending effort on thinking, just as a miser avoids spending money. It's a description of a general tendency, but it by no means describes every person's behavior in every situation. Indeed, some humans expend considerable mental effort even if others do not. And more importantly, a person may be a cognitive miser on one subject or in one situation, even if he or she is not in another. In RBT, considerable attention is drawn to the voluntary nature of algorithmic and reflective thinking, so the one failing to engage is seen as being either disinterested or negligent in doing the work required for good thinking. Consider also the related term, moral miser. Some cognitive scientists, like Daniel Kahneman, for example, will tell you that we're generally hardwired like this, that it's just how it is, and that even though we might do better on some thinking occasions, there's little hope for us getting better overall. But other scientists, like Keith Stanovich, will tell you that good thinking skills are definitely learnable and that there's good reason to work on it. And I find it interesting that this same disagreement about the human mind seems to be present in religion too, with some thinking we're desperately corrupt, while others think we can improve ourselves. While I'm not a scientist by trade, I have studied the question a lot and would definitely gravitate to that second camp, the one that sees a reason to work on our thinking. And I'll demonstrate some of why I think that way in this very episode. I'm going to argue as we go that humans who are of normal physiological health are gifted with brains that can operate at quite a higher level than most of us choose to operate in our daily lives. It's a matter of choice, and it doesn't much depend on your IQ either. Yes, some of us are born with quicker brains than others, just as some are born to be faster runners than others, and that's pretty much what IQ measures, our mental processing speed. IQ stands for intelligence quotient, and it measures certain mental skills and abilities. After all my reading on this subject, I tend to think of IQ as basically a measure of processing speed as with computers. But here's an important fact. IQ tests simply do not measure every thinking skill, and one of the most important things that they leave out is a set of several of the various skills needed for rational thinking, that is, thinking that deliberately seeks to jibe with reality. Now let me pause right here and define how I'm using the word reality. For the record, I mean the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to how one perceives or believes or wishes them to exist. Rational thinking skills are simply not measured on standard IQ tests, nor on IQ test substitutes such as the SAT or ACT. Now that's a big deal. We have in our mental faculties this super important ability for telling the difference between what is real and unreal, and for regulating our beliefs to map accurately onto the real world, and it's left out of the IQ test. Even so, our culture highly values the IQ test, and many important decisions are based on one's IQ scores. College admission and hiring in certain corporations and in the military, most of this is based on IQ. But having a high IQ does not necessarily mean that you would score well on an RQ test. That is, a Rationality Quotient test. And since I've mentioned that, let me mention that there's an RQ test being formulated right now by Keith Stanovich and Richard West and others. And when that test gets out, when millions of people have taken it and their results are compiled and studied, it's really going to be an eye-opener about just how bad things are in our culture when it comes to the neglect of rationality. Really, it should be no surprise at all because we all see the results of irrationality all the time in our culture, and it plagues us in many ways. Things like how our government operates at a deficit, like that could ever be a good idea. And we even have lots of disagreement about what reality is like, even whether it really exists. We disagree about how to solve various problems. We even have debates in which both sides are wrong and political struggles in which both major factions are wrong. Our culture, even at the simple everyday level, is filled with persistent errors, lots of inaccurate sayings that most adopt and never correct. Things like calling it a hot water heater even though its job is to heat cold water. And we call certain tribal peoples in the United States Indians, even though it's been known since the 1600s that they are not from India. The word is even used twice in our Constitution. And we say lots of grossly overstated things like war is good for the economy, where really, it's great for a few and it wrecks the economy for most. And we say lots of unvetted things when it comes to life and popular psychology. Things like, you've got to hit rock bottom before you can get better. Well, that is simply untrue. A person can choose to make improvements at any time. So why are we so inaccurate like this? It's largely because irrationality and irresponsibility are very common in our culture. They're commonly accepted in our society. And why is it so common? Well, for two reasons. One is lack of training and education, and we could talk about that all day, about what can be done to improve the situation. But there's one need that's more fundamental than that, a need that keeps our culture from setting out to fix the problem of the lack of training and education. And what is that? It's the lack of care. That is, we simply do not care too much if our society is highly irrational. And then even if we do, there's the question of how much do we care? Now, both of these things, the training and the caring, are extremely important, and we would be foolish to focus on one without the other. But let me throw out a zinger here. The public school system that our society has come up with generally focuses on neither. They work a lot on education, mind you, but not on the specific topic of rationality. And they don't work on a topic of caring about being rational either. Rather, they seem to avoid it, either as if it doesn't exist, isn't important, or isn't politically expedient. It's as if they have some other motivation than to produce mature adults who are qualified to navigate the waters of reality in a way that is honest, rational, and responsible. We could fix these things, but we choose not to. And when I say we, I'm talking about the society altogether. Perhaps we just don't think it's worth the trouble, or we don't know how. Either way, it's another example of us being quite like that horse that volunteers to be lame in one way, because if we were to put our minds to it, we could definitely figure out how to make this better. We operate at considerably less than our fuller potential, even though lots of us are very busy. We're busy, all right, but not necessarily busy with meeting the business of reality head on. So let's talk about reality in this real world. In this world, there are certain inescapable realities, things that we generally can't do anything about. I'm talking about things like gravity and how it's always on. And gravity is a great example because the stakes are high. That is, it can save your life, and it can also kill you. Learning how gravity works is crucial to long-term survival here on planet Earth. And then there's time. Time is always on too, and as far as we've been able to determine, it always runs only in the one direction. That's forward, for those few in the audience who might not be so sure. And even though people pretty much get how time works, we're constantly making errors when it comes to judging how much time it should take to get this or that done. Then there's the phenomenon of cause and effect, which is also always on. Cause and effect is that aspect of reality by which certain things cause other things, so some are the causes and some are the effects. This is easy to see in science class, but it is often missed in daily life where certain events or causes, such as our decisions and actions, have real-world consequences or effects. In fact, we often get things wrong in ascertaining what causes are causing certain effects and what effects are being caused by certain causes. These errors are rampant in both politics and religion, and they constitute much of the ongoing debate. And then there's the reality of death, which is simply unavoidable, as everybody dies sooner or later. Ultimately, nobody can cheat death. They may not like that fact, but that's just how it is. And finally, let me point out what just may be, surprisingly, the most difficult of all these things for many of us. In the real world, there is work. There is the need to do stuff. There's laundry and dishes and bathing and cooking and eating and cleaning and making money and going to the market for necessary items. There are people to be dealt with and things to be thought through and decisions to be made and things to be planned, and on it goes. One of the main themes that runs through all of human history is this need for work and the constant wishing that it were not so. Some of us, it seems, spend our lives pouting in various degrees of intensity over the fact that certain work needs doing. It's through this anti-work bias that people are so easily manipulated by those promising an easier way. I don't mean to suggest that every easier way is bad. Indeed, sometimes an easy way is actually better, but certainly not always. There are more examples of unavoidable realities, but these 5 examples are plenty to get the point across, that this real world has certain features that are inescapable. But what kind of people are we, and how will we deal with being put here in a world like this one? After all, none of us asked to be here, as far as we can remember. So how will we deal with it as we come to grips with the nature of this place into which our lives have all been set? What kind of people are we? Well, let me state the obvious. Not everybody chooses to deal with reality in the same way. Some of us have developed better skills than others when it comes to perceiving and understanding how things really are. And we all have our habits and patterns of thinking. That's what's called one's cognitive disposition. It's our general set of habits for thinking, how much we think, how often, and for how long, and about what, and in what way, and by what standards do we guide our own thinking, and so forth. And that can vary a lot from one person to another, and indeed it does. But mental skills and processes are not the only consideration here. Again, there's something more fundamental. It's the question of whether we want to see things as they really are. It's the question of what we want to learn. That is, of how curious we are. And it's the question of how excellent at thinking we want to be. How authentic do we want to be? How consistent in our reasoning and in our standards and in our behavior do we want to be? Do we want to acknowledge reality honestly, or do we want to ignore it, or spin it, or twist it, or deny it, or lie about it, and so forth? Is there any untrue thing that we want to believe? And do we want to believe anything that is untrue? These types of questions go beyond our cognitive disposition, and they get into our moral disposition. This is the question of what kind of people we are at our very core. Have you ever seen a friend, or an enemy, say something that's untrue, and upon being corrected on it, refuse to withdraw it and set the record straight? That's a certain aspect of their moral disposition showing right there. You're looking at one of their fundamental values as a person. You're seeing that in this particular case, they don't care whether the thing they have said is true or not, but that some other motivator is in play. And have you ever insisted that the truth be told in some matter? If so, that's your moral disposition showing. And it's very likely that if you're like most people, you've done both. That is, you've been a champion of the truth sometimes and a rebel against it at other times. We see this with individuals quite often in their private lives. We also see it in their professional or social behavior. We see it in advertisements and in politicians and talk show hosts and newscasters and preachers and salesmen and attorneys and teachers. I don't mean to suggest that everybody is like this all the time on every topic, but this sort of inauthentic behavior is very common. And with all the recent talk about fake news, it should be freshly on our minds. Indeed, even in all the fake news talk, there's a lot of untruth going around that needs to be corrected, yet it persists nonetheless. But this does not have to be a way of life for us. And even if our overall society insists on operating this way, we as individuals do not have to live that way. We don't have to stay as we are. We don't have to be like everybody else is choosing to be. we can learn the thinking skills and develop the thinking and moral dispositions necessary to match our thoughts, decisions, and beliefs to reality with a pretty high rate of success, and to do it as a sustainable way of life. We can improve ourselves just for deciding to do it and to do the work that is necessary to make it happen. And that work starts with tackling our thinking. So let me tell you how I define reality-based thinking, or RBT. Reality-based thinking, a philosophy and method of thinking that values honesty, rationality, and responsibility, and that generally seeks to make one's thoughts, decisions, and beliefs jibe with reality by, number one, making the fullest necessary use of the cognitive faculties in order to get things right. Number two, learning, maintaining, and using valid mindware, such as logic, math, language, probability theory, etc., as needed to solve the problems that face us. Number three, refusing to engage cognitive biases. And number four, exercising the self-correction ethic, with reality being the standard to which everything is corrected. We'll talk about all the particulars of this as we go along in this series, but I want to be brief about the details for this first episode. So let's take a moment to define that last item, the self-correction ethic, because really, that's going to be the crux of this whole series of Rethinking the World. That is, I want to rethink it in order to get right what our culture and or subcultures have got wrong. And I don't just want to get it right in my mind so that I can say I've done it. No, I want to get it right in my thoughts, decisions, beliefs, and actions. So here's the self-correction ethic of reality-based thinking. The self-correction ethic. Self-correction is the rightful duty of all humans. In reality-based thinking, self-correction is seen as a fundamental activity of the mature mind and is a standard behavior regardless of subject matter. The philosophical foundation for this is the question, what cognitively and morally healthy person would want to be wrong about anything? An implication of the self-correction ethic is that if we're going to correct ourselves, we're going to have to do the work necessary to make that happen. Self-correction is not a favorite activity, therefore, of the cognitive moral miser. And with that, we'll end part one of this three-part introductory video. In the next video, part two, we'll break reality-based thinking down into some practicals that are very useful, and I'll also explain more of how this series is structured with its different video types. Then in part three, the final installment of this three-part introductory episode, we'll do two things. We'll get into our first rationality word problem, such as will be on the new Rationality Quotient test. This particular problem is the Jack, Ann, and George problem. And other than that, we'll take a look at some of what the Bible says about the importance of good thinking. So thanks for watching this part one, and be sure to watch part two right now.